up our friendly atheist interlocutor, Doug. Doug, are you with us?
Yes, I can hear you. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you and see you. Great. How are you?
Perfect. I'm doing well, thank you.
Good.
So my question is about epistemology. Do you think, Lydia, that it's okay to require more evidence for bigger claims compared to smaller ones?
Define bigger.
I'll define it by using an example. If I tell you I own a car, that's claim number one. Claim number two is when I was a kid, I had a fire-breathing pet dragon. I'm not joking, I had one. So which of these claims would you require more evidence for?
So I take it that you're defining a bigger as having a lower prior probability. Those are the terms in which I think in terms of probability, so that the fire-breathing pet dragon has a lower prior, and therefore, pretty much by definition, you require more evidence on the ground to bring it up from that lower prior probability to a, shall we say, decent level, whatever we're looking for, 0.9 or something, 0.8 or something of what we would call posterior probability. So in that sense, sure, pretty much by probabilistic definition, a claim with a lower prior requires more evidence.
That's great. I agree with you.
Than a claim with a higher prior.
I agree with you. That's excellent. So, so if you would need more evidence or types of evidences to overcome that prior probability of me having a fire-breathing dragon when I was a kid, what evidence would you personally need to see to believe that claim?
I don't know. I can make stuff up. Maybe evidence that there are fire-breathing dragons.
Like if I have a diary from when I was a kid, and I showed it to you, where I talk about it, would that be enough for you to believe I had a fire-breathing dragon when I was a kid?
No, because kids imagine things. They have their imaginary friends.
But I had an uncle who saw it as well, and he wrote in that journal, but he's dead now. Would you believe it then?
I probably want to know a lot more about your uncle before I would conclude that. There has to be some question of why would I believe in the existence of this type of entity.
But you would be skeptical about my uncle and my diary. What if I told you I had like 500 people who saw it when I was a kid? Would you believe it then?
That's so cute. I'm sorry. But,
no, it's an honest, sincere question, because
it's honest and sincere, but do you really think I can't see what you're doing?
No, I'm not assuming that you're not seeing through this. I'm being as blatant as I can.
Okay.
But if we're talking about epistemology, and more specifically for you, Lydia, as a person who values truth,
mm-hmm.
My guess is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that you'd be skeptical, even if I had 500 entries in my diary, different witnesses, you would still be skeptical, I think.
Actually, I'd probably wonder if those were really 500 completely different people, or if
we're
doing different, pretending to be 500 different people or something like that. But now we get into external circumstances. Tim and I wrote a paper that was published by Oxford in an anthology of philosophy of religion a few years ago, and we were talking about the question of reliability. And it's a simple thing that people who work with testimony and probabilistic models of testimony sometimes do. They'll pick a reliability number. They'll be like, okay, suppose the witness is this reliable, and that's fine. It's a nice little shorthand. But what we argued in that article was that reliability, in the relevant sense, often ends up being a matter of the intersection of the external circumstances with the testimony. Okay.
Can I ask you a question about eyewitness testimony before you move on?
Yeah, go for it.
Do you think eyewitness testimony as a ranking of all the different types of evidences out there, including DNA and forensic and so forth, would you rank that near the top, middle, or bottom?
I wouldn't even do it that way. And that's partly because of what I'm saying right here. Because an instance of eyewitness testimony is partly as good as it is made by its surrounding circumstances and by everything else that you know. In other words, you have to get your hands dirty with the specifics of the case.
Okay.
And that was part of the idea that we were getting into. That, for example, a claim for which someone suffers no real ill effects or only very minimal ill effects if he's just lying is not as well supported as a claim he makes where he suffers very ill effects.
Like from my research on eyewitness testimony, it's one of the worst forms of evidence. And I could be wrong about that, but the experts today, anyhow, I think say that, and they have evidence to back it up. But let me ask you a question about eyewitness testimony again. Like there's a lot of huge claims made in the world today. And there's eyewitnesses who are alive. And I think some of these claims you and I would be agreed on, we don't believe.
Mm-hmm.
But yet there's eyewitnesses that you and I could go talk to. I'm thinking about alien abductions, for example. Sure. You and I could get in a jet, fly to someplace in, I don't know, someplace in the world and talk to them eye to eye. And then we could go home and then 6 months later do the same thing and see if their stories changed. But you and I probably would still be skeptical of alien abductions, I think. So my question for you is, do you think alive witnesses are better than dead ones?
Sometimes. For one thing, the way that a court lawyer would say is that you have an opportunity to look at their demeanor. So there's that, what they sound like when they talk. So a live witness allows you to get certain kinds of data that you can't, like right. I said, demeanor, or like you said, asking them to repeat their story. Okay, but then again, a dead witness may end up in some particular case being better because he may say write it out at more length, or his circumstances may tend to support the veracity of his claims more. So, I mean, boy, these kinds of generalizations, I'm just going to resist across the board. Is eyewitness testimony top or bottom? Is a live witness better than a dead one? It just doesn't work that way. It's
Why not?
Very particular because all evidence is very particular. This is empirical, historical evidence we're talking about.
Well, okay, the reason why I bring it up is because when I'm getting to, and again, I want to make this very personal. When you have a person who has a personal epistemology, and they say, look, I looked this guy in the eye, he said he was abducted by an alien. I don't believe him. He even mentioned other people and exact locations. I went and checked it out. Yeah, those locations exist. I still don't believe him. And someone said they had a fire-breathing dragon when they were a kid. And they showed me even pictures and drawings and other people's testimonies. I still don't believe it. Mm-hmm. Now, why is it that some people just are so skeptical of those claims, whereas other people say, you know what, that's good enough. I do believe it. Like, what do you think is the difference within people that some buy it and some don't?
I'm not even really all that interested in the difference between people that some buy it and some don't, but I'm interested in what makes evidence better or worse. And one thing that I would really emphasize that makes evidence better is the willingness to suffer for it, and also the possibility that you could be honestly mistaken. Okay, so yeah. we put together the and especially, we're talking about research into how good eyewitness testimony is just in some incredibly broad sense. In many cases, we're talking about things where a person could be honestly mistaken. They might think somebody had a gun in his hand and really he had a toy gun or something like that. Right. The disciples we're talking about with Jesus' resurrection, for example, I mean, you can't be honestly mistaken about whether one of your best friends is walking around with you for 6 weeks and with 12 of your other friends. I mean, this is a really hard thing. It's not momentary. It's not fleeting. It's not the kind of thing that you go, oh, gee, I just kind of got that one wrong. Sorry, So if
what's a possible
lying?
But what's another possible explanation for that other than, let's say, being mistaken or lying?
That's a very good question. Another possible explanation is that they were telling the truth and that it really happened.
Or maybe the claim didn't even happen in the first place.
But then we have to explain why they said it. Oh, the claim, I see what you're saying, that they didn't claim it. Well, you see, that's where my subsequent research in undesigned coincidences and the Gospels and so forth, and the evidence that they really did come from the original people. Not that, Luke wasn't a disciple himself, but that he interviewed them and so forth. That's where the evidence as to the provenance of these accounts becomes important and relevant. But just talking about the badness of eyewitness testimony or the possibility that somebody's lying or alien abductions, it really doesn't get us down to it, because I haven't ever met anybody who was willing to be beheaded for attesting that he was abducted by aliens. I mean, I don't, I mean, if there are people out there like that, they're crazy. But that's the other thing that we've got.
Okay, so you're saying that because the gospel
crazy, 13 people who were apparently crazy in exactly the same way, such that they were willing to die in highly unpleasant ways for attesting that they walked around and talked with this guy for 6 weeks after he died.
But why do you believe that they actually died for, let's say, what really counts, the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ? How do you know that they died for that reason and not, for example, sedition?
Well, I actually am not saying that they all died. I mean, I actually think John probably died of old age, but were willing to, took the risk of dying, and some did die. Well, because we have records of what they said that they were dying for, and or were willing to die for what they said. Yes, we do. That
they died for the bodily resurrection?
Absolutely. Or were willing to, that they were out there sticking their necks out.
It's not in the Bible.
Actually, I have to disagree with you there, Doug. It is.
Well, maybe James, but I don't think Stephen. James and Stephen are the only ones. Most of what I think you guys are talking about is found in later traditions, correct?
No.
I actually know that. I want to bring Tim in a moment because he had some things to say, but just very briefly on that, Doug, we do actually have very good reason to think that James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, at least, were willing to die as martyrs, and we know that the resurrection.
Martyrs for what?
Right. This is a point that you raise, and the resurrection we can demonstrate was a core linchpin of their faith. And how do we know this? Well, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that he mentions the appearances to the Peter, James, the 12, and the 500, and to himself. And then he goes on to say thereafter, whether then it was I or they, speaking of the other apostles, so we preach, so you believe. So
But how many of the apostles / disciples does the Bible record dying for a bodily resurrection?
The Bible doesn't have to record them actually dying. You have to know about the cultural circumstances in Jerusalem at the time. They first started attesting to this 50 days after the crucifixion of Jesus, at a time when Jesus had just been crucified for this. They were warned not to do so. They were, for all they knew, they could be getting in exactly the same trouble that Jesus got in, because apparently, Pilate was willing to cooperate with putting this down and view it as sedition. Stephen was stoned for it, and the Romans
stoned for what?
Anything. I'm talking about the Christianity that the apostles were preaching, and I'm talking about what would have been in the minds of the apostles. You're all fixated. You're all fixated on what, martyrdoms does the Bible actually record, all right? James, the son of Zebedee, is mentioned in Acts 12. But the point is that these guys are out there knowing that at any moment they can be arrested, they can be dragged and killed, and they're in fact beaten. That is also recorded in Acts. And we have Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost, and he says, but God raised him up, whereof we are witnesses. They're out there boldly proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead and that he's the Messiah.
Lydia, everything you're saying is not answering my question. My question is, how many people in the Bible does it say specifically died because someone said, you either recant that you believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ our Lord, or we'll kill you? And they said, no, I'm not going to recant. So that's my point. It's my point.
Why is that your standard?
Because that's the standard of Christianity.
No, we're talking about people who are risking death, and they know that they are risking death, and they say that they are out there preaching what they are preaching because of the bodily resurrection. And the circumstances tell us that they were risking death and that they had to know that.
Okay, so circumstantial, not direct, overt.
Yeah, but it's very clear. This is historical information. This is historical data. Why in the world would we narrow it down to... this isn't how you would analyze a news story, all right?
Well, let me ask you one more. Jonathan, you probably want me to leave, but do you view absence of evidence as a form of evidence?
Sometimes extremely weak. Very often it's extremely weak. Strictly, formally, probabilistically, it can be. But in that sense, you've received absence of evidence for an infinite number of people today, all the infinite number of people from whom you haven't heard today, the infinite number.
Like, for example,
so it's often a very, very weak argument.
Do you think it's a weak argument if, let's say, today, well, there's an eclipse coming, but let's say today, for example, in the United States, the sky went dark for 3 hours, and then 50 years from now, not one historian, not one news article talks about it?
Because we live in the internet age, that would have a stronger tendency to argue against it. If it happened in the 1st century AD, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Believe it or not, there was no internet back then.
So the fact that there was...
It come as a surprise.
Yeah, well, I think that's a... please don't take offense to this, but I think it's a convenient answer, because I would think that things like the sky going dark for 3 hours, the temple curtain being torn asunder, that's a big deal back then.
Somebody would have live blogged it for sure.
No, I'm talking even back then. Historians would have mentioned it.
No.
But
do you know how much history we have? Do you know how many shelves?
Zombies walking around the streets of Jerusalem? You don't think any historian would have mentioned that?
Do you know how many historians we even have who were even in Jerusalem at the time? These are local events. Do you know how much?
All I'm asking is for one.
Yeah, and we don't have very many at all.
We have none who mention those things I mentioned.
All of the books, no, I mean that even were historians of that time. All of the books we have from that time would fill, I believe, one shelf, including a play by Nero's Pimp. Okay, there is not a whole lot that survives from that time whatsoever.
So
that's a stinky argument. Once you really realize, go ahead, Tim.
I just want to say, Doug, do you know how many sources mention the destruction of the temple in AD 70? One, and that's Josephus. As in the 1st century, anyway. In the 1st century, the only source that mentions the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is Josephus.
Yeah, but this is actually making my point for me, that because there's such a dearth, such a scarcity of these historians talking about these things, and yet we have this huge claim that a man walked on water, rose from the dead, and so forth. Should that not lower our confidence that it's true?
No, because we have to look at the specifics of the evidence. We're not just nose counting. Nose counting is an extremely crude way to approach it.
Well, let me put it this way. Let me turn it around. Would your confidence go up if we did have that?
Have what?
Let's say we had 3 historians that are not found within the Bible that mentioned the darkness for 3 hours, that mentioned the curtain torn asunder, that mentioned dead people coming out of the graves and walking through the streets of Jerusalem. Would your confidence go up? Like, whoa, this is amazing. Not only do we have it in the Bible, but we have it over here.
I don't know if it would be, I would be as excited as you portray. Sure, that would be some external confirmation, but something you need to know, and Tim has a paper on this, okay, is that some evidence E can be enormously strong evidence for a hypothesis H, but the absence of E may be very poor evidence against the hypothesis H. Those are not symmetrical by any means. And we can see this in very ordinary life. If I receive an email from somebody, that is very strong evidence that that person exists. But if I don't receive an email from that person, that's not really terribly good evidence that he doesn't exist. So there's an enormous asymmetry between the amount of force that something can have for a hypothesis and the amount of force that its absence has against that hypothesis.
Let me just interrupt to bring on Tim McGrew, because he wanted to make some comments. I'll leave Doug in the panel so that he can respond if he wants to. Okay, go ahead, Tim.
Sure. Well, there are a bunch of things here, Doug, that you've been saying that I think deserve some extensive reconsideration. Let's start with the question of the value of eyewitness testimony. I put in the chat a couple of links to some papers in Legal Studies 1980, Journal of Applied Psychology 1978, that show conditions under which eyewitness testimony is strong. And it's exactly the kinds of things that you would expect. Eyewitness testimony is weakest when we've got stranger identification, when the events take place very briefly, when there's a weapon focus, when there's poor lighting, cross-racial identification is hard, and all of those things are things that come up sometimes when we're tracking testimony in court cases. None of those conditions apply to the kind of eyewitness testimony that the Christians are putting forward for the events of the resurrection and the following observations. And so it just won't do to say that eyewitness testimony is highly unreliable, just simplicator. That's just not a reasonable way to go. On the point of arguments from silence, the point that Lydia is making can be illustrated very easily. You can have, for example, if I were to look down at the table here, I'm sitting in a coffee shop, and to see a spider walking across the table, that would be excellent evidence that there's a spider somewhere in the coffee shop. But if I look at the table and I don't see a spider walking across the table, that's really not very strong evidence that there's not a spider anywhere in this coffee shop. Spiders may well be here without my seeing them. So you can have the positive thing be strong evidence and the negative thing be very weak evidence. And that's the fundamental point that Lydia is trying to make when she says this. So I just think also you're attempting to say yes, but do they say exactly this? Oh, wow. There are a lot of events in history where we don't have someone standing up and saying expressly, yes, I will go to my death to maintain this point, that are nevertheless very well evidenced. And so I really think that that's a kind of artificial construction of the kind of evidence you should like to have, but that can't be used as an excuse for looking carefully at the sort of evidence we do have. There is no more unreasonable way of approaching things than to say, because there's not the kind of evidence here that I could name that would be stronger, I will not believe. I can do that for any historical event. Name an event. Name any historical event you like, and I can name a kind of evidence that I don't have that would have been still better evidence than we do have. And the very fact that I can do that is really nothing.
Okay, can I respond to some of the things you said?
Yeah, but you know, I'm laying these out because you've been going on for quite some time, making quite a lot of claims that I think are just epistemically.
I haven't been making. I've been asking questions. I get confused in making claims when I ask questions.
Let me restate that. The fact that you're asking those questions is, I think, evidence that you're coming from a perspective that's epistemically confused. And I think that's bad. I think that
Can I respond to some of your points?
Go for it.
I did not say that eyewitness testimony was bad. I'm saying when you rank it to other types of evidences, it ranks poorly overall. That's point number one.
Okay. Okay, let's just stop right there and talk about that. There is no such thing as a ranking of eyewitness testimony simplicator. You must consider the circumstances. That's the point of Sanders and Warren's articles. Okay,
but how many articles did you put in to the chat that spoke of eyewitness testimony in a poor fashion?
They are studies that are interacting with prior studies that have already been done on that, and they're asking the question, why is it that sometimes it's poor and sometimes it's strong?
Did you put any links in the chat that talk about the downsides of eyewitness testimony?
Yes, Clifford and Scott.
Okay, great. Okay, point number two, you said that the absence of evidence.
Are you really asking me to give you more links, or you won't take seriously the information?
No. I'm just asking if you have presented the other side or not, and if you have, great.
These are articles that are dealing with the evidence for the other side already, and that's the reason that they're doing this.
Great. You've answered my question. Hey, I'm happy. Great.
Okay, good.
And then when you're talking about the spider and the absence of evidence and so forth, would you expect that when you have a huge event like the sun or it going dark for 3 hours today, or even back then, let's put it back 2,000 years ago, do you have any expectation that someone would write about that?
Are you asking now about, say, the darkness at?
I'm asking for your personal. It's very noisy, Tim.
Sorry. That coffee shop, I can't do anything about it.
I'm asking your personal expectations of a huge event like a going dark for 3 hours. Do you personally have an expectation that historians, at least one, would write about that? That's not found in the Bible.
That we would still have today, so that when we look for sources, we would still be able to identify those sources today.
Yeah.
No, why should I? There's hardly anything that's
okay, so that's the difference between you and me. and that's, I don't know why that we have that difference, but I would expect that and you wouldn't. And do we, speaking about absence of evidence, would you agree that it's at least likely or possible that maybe some of the Christians at that time did recant and we just don't have evidence for it or record of it?
That some of them may have recanted?
Yeah.
It is possible, but since Christianity was the focus of a lot of direct pressure at that time, I think it would be likely that we would have the evidence of that if that had been anyone prominent, maybe.
And would you factor that evidence? Would you factor that evidence in your overall confidence in the belief that some could have recanted?
Sure, but I think it's not a high I don't think it's a high probability that given the evidence that we actually have.
Okay, I can accept that answer. I like that answer.
Can I just go back to the darkness of the sun for a moment?
Hey Tim, can I just ask, when Doug is speaking, perhaps you could mute yourself and then unmute yourself when you want to speak, just to cut out the background noise. That'd be good. Yeah, good. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is an old objection. It comes up in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, chapter 15. Gibbon says that a distinct chapter of Pliny is devoted to eclipses of an unusual and extraordinary nature and unusual duration. But he contents himself with describing the secret defect of light which followed the murder of Caesar. And this quotation that he says is in Pliny, it's hilarious because when you actually go and you look at the chapter in Pliny, here's the entire chapter. Unusually long portentous eclipses of the sun also take place, as when Caesar the dictator was slain, and in the war against Antony, the sun remained dim for nearly a year. Period. End of Pliny's discussion. That's it. Skeptics like Gibbon have tried to say, hey, since Pliny the naturalist tells us all about eclipses, why wouldn't he record this one? The fact of the matter is, even Pliny, the only person we have who makes any record of them, mentions only two. The chapter in Latin is, I believe, 17 words long. So I think you're seriously overestimating the survival of material by people who are interested in things like this from the 1st century or even the 2nd century to the present day. And that is something that we don't have to guess about.
I hear what you're saying. Tim, I hear what you're saying.
Just a moment, let me finish, okay, and then I'll mute my microphone. We don't have to say, well, you just approach this differently than I do. We can calibrate this by looking at the historical evidence we actually have. And when we calibrate it, it's just not a significant argument. It doesn't have much weight.
Can you? Yeah, thank you. I think for guys who call themselves skeptics, or for just non-believers, for Jews, Orthodox Jews who study history and so forth, a lot of things I'm saying, it is a powerful argument for them and for me. The fact that I would expect somebody at that time to write about dead people walking around Jerusalem, the temple curtain being torn asunder. So I understand you don't expect that, but we do. Now you might say, well, that's because we have this bias against miracles or whatever, and all that sort of thing. But I think this is a sincere and honest point of view that we're coming from. So yeah, it looks like you're muted, by the way. I can't hear anything you're saying. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah. First point, we do. It's recorded in the Gospel according to Matthew. So we do have a 1st century testimony to it. Second point, when Lazarus is raised from the dead, as the story runs in John chapter 11, what's the response of the Jewish leaders?
I don't know.
What do they say in John chapter 12?
Well, let me tell you. Verses what? John 12 what? You're muted.
Go ahead, Tim.
I'm sorry, Jonathan. Am I?
Yeah, you are
am
muted.
I back?
You're back.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is a little bit tricky.
Sorry.
Yeah, look at John 12, verse 10.
Verse 10, it says, so the leading priests made plans to kill Lazarus too.
Right. So that's their reaction to someone's coming back from the dead. Let's kill him again. Make sure this time it sticks. If the events Matthew narrates really were events that took place, if some people who must have been people known to inhabitants of Jerusalem at that time had really come out of their graves, what do you think the early Christian community would have been likely to do? Post their names and addresses online? Given that this is the reaction of the Jewish authorities?
Can you repeat back to me what my expectation would be? My expectation would be that a historian would have mentioned it.
Which historian?
Let's say Suetonius, for example.
Suetonius, a Roman historian writing about Roman affairs who lived in Rome.
Well,
probably never visited Palestine in his life. And you would expect that he would write about a rumor of a couple of people coming out of their graves in Palestine 80 years
where did
before he was writing.
Oh boy, we're getting really stuck into the muck and mire
Really?
minutiae, aren't we?
You're asking the question.
Where did Josephus write from? Where did Josephus write from?
Yeah, Josephus is writing. Well, he's writing in Rome, but
yeah, do you discount Josephus
within his lifetime?
Do you discount Josephus because he wrote in Rome about Jesus?
No, I love Josephus.
Okay, so why would you discount Suetonius?
When did Josephus live? When did Josephus live, and where did he live?
He You're funny, Tim.
Okay.
He was born, I think 33, 34 AD and died in, I don't know, was it 100?
So he'd be just somewhere close to that. So he'd be talking about events that took place before his birth.
See,
So
Tim,
for
you're
that,
you're backtracking because
sources. Would he need sources?
Tim,
For
you're
events that
backtracking
transpired
because you
before
just
his
said,
birth.
why would Suetonius write about something if he lived in Rome? And you're kind of poo-pooing that idea. And then at the same time, you say my guess is you treasure what Josephus said about Jesus, who wrote from Rome.
Can I respond to this? Okay,
Yes.
I pointed out that in no respect, neither in respect of place, nor in respect of time, nor in respect of the focus of what he's writing about, would Suetonius have been someone who would be expected to take any notice whatsoever of that event. So you got 3 strikes against Suetonius, and he's the one you brought up. Now you want to move on to Josephus. Let's talk about that. In location, he did in fact.
So your argument is
in Palestine. Wait, I'm not done. Okay, he lived in Palestine. Okay, so good. One positive thing there. Who's he concerned about? Like all historians, he's concerned about the lives of the great and the noble and the powerful. What's the period of time which his personal observation covers? It's got to be
Tim,
the period of time from his adult lifetime.
Tim.
Wait, I'm not done. No. Doug, you wanted to go there. Let's talk about Josephus. Okay? So here's somebody who has to use sources for an event like this. And then this event, a minor event taking place in a tumultuous festival where a few people say, hey, we've seen some people who were dead and they're back to life. Why would you expect that Josephus even would have sources that would mention that other than the Gospels if he had access to the Gospels?
Tim, can I summarize your point of view?
Why would you expect that he would write about it? Yeah.
Tim, I want to summarize to prove to you I'm listening to you. You're basically saying, yes, Doug, this is a pretty amazing event, this sky going dark or people coming out of the graves. But we shouldn't expect anybody to even care or write about this sort of thing. And maybe someone did, but we just don't have record of it. But yeah, Suetonius, why would he even care? Josephus. My expectation, Doug, is that for this point in history, we shouldn't expect someone other than in the Bible to write about it. Am I summarizing you correctly?
Partially. I don't think the darkness was worldwide. I think it was over the whole of the land. Probably.
Okay, Tim, if I've summarized you correctly, can you summarize my position correctly?
I think your position is that these were events of such a striking nature, and that the documentary remains of the middle of the first century are sufficiently robust that if these events took place, we should expect to see record of them outside of the Christian sources. I think that's your position.
Okay, now, yeah, that's pretty close. Now, why are you and I so different? Could it be that I am just I really don't want to believe this, so I'm using this as an excuse to say, I'm justified in not accepting these propositions. And on the flip side, are you a person who say, I do want to believe this, and so therefore my expectation is that this wouldn't happen? Like, is that what's happening here with me and with you?
I don't think so. I don't think that's what's happening on either side, actually. I think what's happening with you is that through a wildly optimistic view of the documentary remains of the middle of the first century, you are vastly overrating the probability that we would have some source that didn't have a direct interest, like the Christian sources did, reporting this. I think that you're just wildly overestimating that probability, and that's why you're making this argument from silence. On my side, frankly, there are a lot of things that I would be perfectly fine to have direct evidence for, but since we don't, we go with the kinds of evidence that we do. When Lydia brought up the circumstances, you said, so the evidence is circumstantial. Lots of evidence is circumstantial. You can condemn a man to death on a circumstantial case, and you can be right. For that purpose, I would recommend maybe you're having a look a little bit more at historical evidence of that kind.
Let's maybe wrap up that particular dialogue here, because I want to try and squeeze in a couple more.
Yeah, I totally feel like I've welcomed my stay, but I just want Tim to understand that I am listening to you, Tim, and I understand your position. That what I just heard you say is that it's maybe a lack of knowledge on my part, that I haven't studied enough history, and my expectations of what should be written about is wrong or not complete. So I hear what you're saying, Tim. I understand what you're saying. But my only response, and this will be the last thing I say, my only response to that is that there are people on this planet who know the history better than you and me combined times 10, and they still have the same expectation as me.
Okay, thanks both of you, Doug and Tim. Let's move on at this point. Let's bring up